When does an architect with a typical contract perform a cost estimate? I get asked this question all the time. It's kind of a fascinating one. And whenever I do something like this, I always put in a D here. An architect never performs a cost estimate because there's a whole school of thought that architects shouldn't do cost estimates because that's just not their strength, that they just don't bring a lot of useful information for that. And in a lot of other countries, that's actually quite true. You have cost estimating as a whole division, a whole separate industry in the United Kingdom and in Germany and a bunch of other places. So in the United States, where we're talking about here, the architect actually does perform cost estimates actually pretty regularly. So then it's not D, so the question becomes, all right, well then what is it? A would be at the end of each phase of design, schematic design, design development, and contract documents. That seems like a reasonable answer, but let's look at the other ones. Let's go through. B says at the beginning of the project to set the scale, and then again after the contract document phase to start off construction. That one seems a little problematic. I'll come back to that in a second. C, at the beginning of a project, at the end of schematic design, and at the end of design development. So the question here really becomes which of these makes the most sense for the architect's use of time? And the kind of catcher here is why would the architect be doing a cost estimate at the end of the contract document phase? If you think about it, that's what bidding is. So you're not doing it, you're handing it out to a bunch of other people. It is important that you're doing it at the end of the SD phase and at the end of the DD phase, just to make sure that you're on track. So those are not going to be highly detailed, especially at SD. As you get into DD, it's probably going to get pretty detailed. You're going to be pretty close to a real cost estimate. But you need to be doing those in order to make sure everything's on track in terms of the cost of the project. But by the time you get to the end of CDs, it's sort of too late for you to do a cost estimate. Now you're handing it over to the bidders, and they're going to do the cost estimate for you. So in the end, A is not the correct answer, and C does make a great deal of sense. So if you think of it, how would you start a project if you hadn't thought about what the cost and scale and budget was? So you're going to be doing a very simple version of a cost estimate at the beginning of the project. You're going to do it at the end of schematic design to make sure you're still on track, and you're going to do it at the end of design development in order to make sure before you go into that whole contract document phase, okay, we've made a bunch of decisions that we leaped quite a bit from schematic design into our design development, but when we made that leap, we've got to make sure that we haven't accidentally let it creep out of control or just missed the mark, and maybe it's too little. Almost never is too little, almost always too much. But by the time you get to that end of design development, it's very difficult to backtrack through. So you want to make sure, and you're going to do all you can to make sure that the end of that design development is actually making sense, both from a design standpoint. You're comparing it back to the program, you're comparing it to the code reviews you've done, you're comparing it to all of those different things. So we're still on track, it's still the right building, it's still going to fit in this urban context, and you're comparing it back to your initial budget information and checking what you think the cost actually is. Does it still sit right with that initial budget? So absolutely C would be the answer. And then at the end of CDs, we got the bidders to give us the bids at that point. So now it's in the ballpark of the contractors. So C would be the answer.
Awesome.